Hi, I'm here today with Catherine Atkin. She's known as the architect of SB 253 and 261, and she's been instrumental in the implementation of those groundbreaking laws here in California. She's also, I believe, a co-founder of the consultancy Carbon Accountable, and she's here today to talk to us about the process of passing those laws and the implementation process, and also a little bit about voluntary carbon markets because I'm just very, very curious about them. So thanks very much for coming on, Catherine.
Patrick, great to be with you. Thanks for your efforts to bring this community together. It's a super exciting time for attorneys in this space, and it's also kind of in a lot of ways, it's a tabula rasa, right? We're all figuring out like what this means to serve clients well during this, in this next phase of our efforts to create a decarbonized economy, so we can all be here in the future together.
Oh, and I know, and thank you for your efforts. I often talk about how jealous I am of European colleagues who have hard laws that they're advising clients on, whereas oftentimes we're advising on kind of more intangible investor risk, customer risk issues like that. But now in California, there's hard law that companies have to abide by that we have to advise on. So thanks very much for your efforts in those regards. So maybe you could tell me a little bit about why they call you the architect of SB 253
Oh.
and 261, other than it kind of sounds cool.
Yeah. Well, first I would say that's a very lowercase, or lowercase t if they call you the
Yeah.
architect.
Well,
And
I
lowercase
called you
a,
at
but
least. So
thanks, Patrick. No, but really, I mean, it's one of those kind of things that many of you all know doesn't happen that many times in your career, where you're just able to come in at the right time, recognize that there's an opportunity to add value, and then to actually see all the players come together that are required to take anything from an idea to a new statute in California that has implications for all US companies, but also has global impact. So I have to say, I'm like super grateful to have been able to just kind of be there at the right time. I mean, for me, the impetus for this legislation was kind of recognizing I came into the clients to the climate space, and as an attorney was trying to figure out where can I add the most value. And so obviously it's kind of a no-brainer to think about the policy environment. And as I looked at where we were at, and this was about 5 years ago, recognized that we had a very weak GHG data ecosystem, right? We did not have the kind of baseline data and the confidence in the data that could create the kind of markets that would be required to actually like decarbonize both the public and private sectors. And so,
you need to
that to
monetize the externalities, right? Like I often say that if we're really going to address climate impacts, we need to monetize the externalities that these companies are placing. In order to properly monetize that, we need a proper market, and to have a proper market, we need proper data. We need proper information. That's the thought? And then we need laws to guide that information gathering.
No, totally, Patrick, you got it. And so well said. And I think the recognition in this situation was that the laws didn't come afterwards, that you actually don't get the data that you need without a compliance environment. And that's like, you can say, why didn't corporations do this before? It's like, let's be real. When you have a business model, as you said, that doesn't require the accountability for carbon and other sustainability data, actually, then you're not going to change business models, and you're not going to make that part of the bottom line. So really, this was an example of we needed to create mandatory GHG and climate risk disclosure so that we could actually give those companies and the C-suite the kind of impetus to go in and do some things that were going to take some work and will actually require some change. So it was an opportunity to look at what was happening globally, and in Europe is really ahead of us when it comes to climate and sustainability, and actually just ESG, valuing that in the private sector. And so looking at California and also thinking about California's long history of environmental leadership, right? So it's it's not like this hadn't been done before. California has consistently put down a marker and said, this is where California is going to go. And therefore, there goes, the rest of the country, whether it was toxics, cap and trade, low carbon fuel standard. So this was just another sort of turn of the wheel, the recognition that if we really want to protect California's population or the residents of California, as we know, we can't just close down the California borders and take care of our own GHG emissions. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
So if we're actually going to protect, the future of California, we have to actually address the global GHG emissions that are creating, as we know already, the climate change and extreme weather. So all of that, I think, has pushed this conversation forward. So what started out as kind of a little engine that could about almost 4 years ago, over time, I think this was a new topic, and people, policymakers in the private sector, and it took a while to kind of figure this out.
So it's
But it really was, yeah,
So it sounds like there was just the opportunity because you were with your own company, so you had a bit of autonomy. You also had a legal background and the environmental technical background, and so you had that kind of sufficient to kind of start the ball rolling. At what point did you feel like it was more than just a funny idea that
yeah,
you told people at cocktail parties and was actually like something that was a real snowball
yeah.
going down the hill?
I mean, it's funny you say it that way because I do like relate that. I mean, there was a couple years there where people sort of patted me on the head. I'm
Yep.
here in Silicon Valley. I'm in the middle of all, and I'm a big, devotee of, the climate economy and the innovation that takes place here. And, it took a while for people also to realize, my argument was, hey, especially in Silicon Valley, especially in California, we're winners when it comes to leveling the playing field and really driving towards a climate economy. We know how to do that. Our climate tech companies, these are the markets that are going to allow them to actually deploy at scale, right? If a company doesn't have to think about its scope 3, its supply chain, where's the incentive for them really to, in a big way, deploy new solutions to decarbonize their supply chain? So really, for the first couple years, it was a sort of, and I think that for any of us that do something, we also recognize things do take time. And I knew that it would take a while because it was kind of we were getting an inflection point, and hopefully this conversation on SB 253 and 261 was part of making that change as well. But I would say it was we went through 3 years with this. So the first couple years were a little bit more lonely than the great convergence we experienced later. But let me just say a couple of important elements to that. Was one, a well-crafted policy that, I think obviously I'm going to say that, but I feel like as attorneys, we have an opportunity to get the bones of whatever we're trying to do right. And then alongside of that, to bring along the right champions, and also to realize, as you said, I was sort of out there. I had worked on a project at the Stanford Law School called the Climate Data Policy Initiative. That's a nonpartisan effort, but it was a place to get smart about like, where are we in this space? And then created, along with a colleague, an entity called Carbon Accountable, which was really the vehicle for this legislation. So I've had an opportunity to work on different kind of large scale policy changes before. So I sort of, have a feel for what the essential elements are. And so, you have to have a good policy, but you also have you need the right supporters. And early on, Cal Enviro voters was, and actually Sunrise Movement, some of the grassroots advocates were the early partners on this, and creating space for everybody, to do their part. We brought on Ceres, which is an investor network, in the last year and a half, and that made a tremendous difference. So, I would say that, it's kind of recognizing as attorneys, what is our special sauce, but recognizing that alone isn't enough to actually get these major policy changes over the finish line. You kind of have to have an appreciation for the role of the advocacy world, and also the role of of the corporate sector to come in and be champions for this.
It's that's a wonderful analysis. So the early part is policy, ensure that your policy is strong, the bones of what you want to do are strong. So then you could find the right partners, at least
Mhm.
colleagues to help support it, as well as advocacy groups and business groups that are willing to support it as well. And then you can take it to legislators, and it kind of goes up and it gets faster and faster. I don't know if that's exponential growth or not, but the idea is
Yeah.
it's slowly and faster and faster and faster, and then it almost takes on a life of its own at some point. Was there ever a feeling that this is taking on a life of its own, that you didn't have your arms wrapped around the meat
Yeah.
of what this bill is going to be?
Yeah. I mean, that's whenever anything happens in life that's kind of, it is more than the sum of its parts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so I'll describe that, but I did want to go back and say it was good policy, but also you got to have the right legislative leader. And I
Of
just want to
course.
say, Senator Scott Wiener, like picking somebody, knowing what you're trying to do. And we knew this was going to be, very, there's going to be a lot of opponents to this bill, that you needed somebody who would, who had the confidence in a relatively new policy area, and just the toughness to keep going. So I want to just acknowledge him. Back to when it became like bigger than like, it
Yeah.
was really in the last 6 months. It really wasn't, I mean, we could see the momentum building after the second year, and we had series come on board. We had then when you first started, it was, seeing this kind of like quickening was first Microsoft came on board, and then we had Salesforce, and then, Apple came on board. And actually those things, it really takes those first really brave, breaking ranks, I'd have to say, companies to then create space for others to come on board. And I would just say, for, when it comes to those companies, it's not like a lot of them weren't environmental leaders, but there is this awkwardness of, as we know, one of the things that I think is important in the climate space, and I saw it kind of happening here, is companies realizing it's not enough for us to just be good actors ourselves. We have to be stewards for the private sector and for corporates, right? Like it's not enough for us to clean up our own house. We have to go out and be part of a community. So that to me was really important.
Well, and you talk about creating a market, and in the human rights context as well, it's often the case that even a large buyer doesn't have as much leverage as the industry as a whole. So there's something to be said for just making sure that best practices are a standard, so that the individual best actors aren't outliers,
Right.
but it's also there's so much more change that can happen when the best practices become a floor that everyone's doing and everybody has a shared interest in accomplishing them. And even as a lawyer, you can avoid issues like, for instance, like antitrust concerns, because
Yeah.
industry groups are
Yeah.
cooperating on a specific topic. If
Yeah.
industry groups are cooperating to address a
Yeah.
regulation that's come out,
Yeah.
that gives them the ability to do that.
Exactly. No, really good point. And I do think the point of this law, as you said, was to create an even playing field where the good actors, don't have to do the hard thing, and then others get to sort of keep legacy approaches that, and that we're going to treat everybody equally. And like you said, create sort of a floor that pushes everybody forward. So yeah, I think great points.
And it's not even just the good actors, it's also those multinationals that are subject to the EU regulations that we were talking about. They want to make sure that their competitors that might only be California based or somewhere else, they're also adhering to those same standards.
Yes, to your point, I also think one of the tail, like if there's headwinds on something and tailwinds, one of the tailwinds for us was that many of these largest companies knew they were going to be subject to CSRD,
Yeah.
to the EU's mandatory ESG reporting requirement. So I definitely feel like, that was another element to the ecosystem. The factors that drove this forward was also some companies saying, okay, we're already going to be doing this, right? And don't we want our competitors to also have to do this just because they don't happen to have a headquarter in the EU or be publicly listed on one of the EU country exchanges? So good point.
That brings me to the kind of the next topic that I wanted to
Yeah,
talk about. I wanted to talk about now the implementation process. Now
yeah,
that you found your champion
yeah,
and Scott Representative Wiener has passed the
yeah,
legislation
yeah.
and we're at the second phase now. I wanted to ask with respect to implementation, how have you thought about harmonizing the law that comes the harmonizing whatever regulations come out of these laws
Yeah,
such that they are consistent with
yeah.
CSRD. You know
No,
where I'm going. You know
I
where I'm going.
totally get where
Yeah.
you're going. No, and I mean that one, going back to kind of, good policy, to me, good policy also was not reinventing the wheel. And I do think sometimes there's kind of it's hard to resist the temptation to make like your own flavor of ice cream, and I think sometimes, that is something that corporates have been concerned about in California is that, they're going to have to do hard stuff but not only it's hard, but sometimes it's a little bit different. So we really had a value for like, we do not want to recreate, any other standard that already exists. So that's why we adopted the GHG protocol as the standard. So the law explicitly states that you must report in conformance with the GHG protocol, which is the preeminent global accounting and reporting standard for GHG emissions. I'm talking about SB 253 right now. And the good news is we also knew that is a throughput in every other mandatory or voluntary reporting regime globally. So even if they don't mandate the use of that standard, it's always front and center. So for CSRD, it's the GHG protocol. Or you can things that are basically aligned to it. There's a few ISO standards, and then with the ISSB, which is outside, right? The EU created its ESG mandatory disclosure requirement, and then for the rest of the globe, there was this large effort to create a standard that could be adopted by countries, and that also identifies the GHG protocol. So that to me was fundamentally the best way to align and ensure that companies, if you report to the GHG protocol, my advice to companies, and I'm not the only one, is, report to the most exacting standard. And then you're going to be covered for anything else you do, right? It's going to be copy and paste. So if you report to California's, to the GHG protocol, you will have your GHG emissions ready for anywhere else. In terms of regulations, the promulgation, the other opportunities we have to streamline reporting is really one that I'm become passionate about. Actually, I didn't really know a lot about, hadn't been focused on before, is really digital interoperability. I do think we have technology solutions now. We have these large global data taxonomies. The CSRD and the ISSB both require digital tagging with this open standard called XBRL. This is way in the weeds, but the reality is the idea is if you're all reporting, scope 3 category 1, the tag for that should be the same everywhere. And then once you're tagged, then the pipes really work well, right? Then things go right into reports that we can aggregate that data into larger global data lakes. So I think that that's another opportunity. And then just to use AI and new technology to take information that exists in other reports and to use it to report to things like SB 253.
Is
So
it kind of like is it kind of like taking information that might be on a spreadsheet and almost taking that data and making it a throughput so you can see how it goes from scope 3 to scope 1? Is that kind of the thought?
yeah, exactly. And it's like if
Well,
you
that's
have
good because I just came up with that.
yeah, so if we're still, regardless of what reporting regime, if the actual data is the same
Yeah.
and it's defined by the same standard, then we should be able to tag that data, right? And so that it's all kind of just you can use it wherever you need to. And
That's the digital interoperability.
that's inter
Yeah.
so I think that's I feel like and one issue that I'm also thinking more and more about is the accessibility of the data. So just because data is reported doesn't mean that it becomes accessible to the kind of global stakeholders. So that's another important element of this is we could have reported data in all these exchanges and countries. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but those are some of the, I mean, the reg promulgation process in California is it's underway. So now's an opportunity for corporates to also share, what for them would make this process more streamlined.
Yeah, and so it sounds like there wasn't we're talking about market. There wasn't necessarily a demand for a lot of these tools because there was no law. Now that there's a demand for digital data tools. There's also a demand for service providers like lawyers. Can you tell us a little bit about how the legal world should
Yeah.
respond now that we're in this new world?
Yeah. I mean, I think, like you said, I mean, one of the things that is exciting about this is that with a relatively simple compliance regime, we have we're driving the development of all of these elements of what we absolutely need to develop a climate economy. I mean, there's no way, without all of those players incentivized and rewarded appropriately, we cannot create that ecosystem for the kind of broad scale adoption of new business models. So, I feel like for attorneys, I mean, as we know, new laws are always, generally not a bad thing for attorneys. But I would just say, I think this is a whole new area. And there's been, attorneys, I feel like, in-house counsel. I mean, I've talked to so many attorneys that prior to this, it just really wasn't on their radar. And now it is. And I think that there is the risks associated with disclosure are real. And it's not only the mandatory reporting, as you well know, we're seeing many more litigation tools being used, a lot more scrutiny of companies and their how they talk about their net zero targets and their progress, how they
If
brand their
anything, this is
products.
beneficial to companies because companies were quite cavalier over the last 5 to 10 years about making net zero commitments and making representations that could amount to greenwashing. And there's been a backlash from litigators. I'm very, very much aware, obviously, because litigation's my forte. So to some extent, it's probably good that now companies are really taking their obligations seriously
Yeah,
and from an organizational standpoint, I speak with a lot of European lawyers who talk a lot about their work in an advisory capacity is one
yeah,
advising on the text of the law
yeah,
and putting it in practice, but a lot of that requires change management,
yeah.
organizational change management, which requires obviously input from the top and an interdepartmental coherence.
Oh, so true. I mean, uh, it is a gift that keeps on giving. And I think once you create like a forcing function,
Yeah.
now we're seeing, that C-suite kind of add new seats at the table. The CSO is the chief sustainability
Yeah, yeah.
officer is now there in a different way than they were before. I'm also, it's not only in-house counsel, but also the CFO
Yeah.
and the chief financial officer. So it's getting to be like we're now this is high stakes and as it should be. I mean, and so I think this opportunity, as you said, for the attorney that to be kind of looking at the entire ecosystem, for the benefit of the company is got to be exciting and a creative opportunity. It's obviously going to be a time where there's going to have to be more internal controls put in place. So I see a whole new landscape as well for like all the apparatus that was involved in financial reporting now has to be retooled to add on this climate risk and GHG emissions reporting.
Yeah, think about it in terms as a legal professional. It seems that lawyers that have a background in reporting due diligence are
Yeah.
probably well placed to get guidance from other lawyers that have an environmental background. That you almost, if you just take an environmental law
Right.
specialist, they don't have the reporting background, and the reporting people don't have the environmental background. I actually want something that is both.
Yeah.
Another thing you need is to actually compile the data properly. And to
Yeah.
undertake that, you have to do proper due diligence,
Yep.
particularly with respect to scope three emissions, which are
Yep.
obviously emissions from your through your supply chain.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of costs and then opportunity.
Yeah.
And when we talk
Yeah.
about opportunity, I want to talk about the
Yeah.
carbon markets and things like that.
Yeah.
But with respect to cost, I wanted to talk a little bit about how much this costs companies, but also companies
Yeah.
based in California, but also how are they passing those costs up the stream, like
Yeah.
down the
Yeah. Yeah.
supply
Yeah.
chain to their suppliers? And do the suppliers have the smaller suppliers have the wherewithal to meet these reporting obligations?
Right. Well, in terms of the cost of compliance, I mean, this is one of those that, I mean, we picked a threshold for the GHG emissions reporting, it's $1 billion in revenue, and for the
Mhm.
climate risk disclosure, it's 500 million. So these are not small companies, right?
Mhm.
So for them, I think estimates of the cost of emissions reporting, GHG emissions reporting are don't, quote me on this, but maybe around $250,000. You might double that if you add in climate risk. So for a billion-dollar company, that is like budget dust, right? So it's not so
And
much.
this is important, and there's all different kinds of reporting requirements. Yeah, no, I don't have a harp or whatever for these companies, the largest companies. I think they'll do fine. I guess,
Yeah,
but my question goes further, maybe more because they're going to require
right,
their suppliers
right.
who might not have the wherewithal,
That's
which
where
is a
the
good
question.
thing, which is important because we can't just ask the largest companies to do
Yeah,
this alone because they don't have
yeah.
all the information. So how do you?
Exactly. And I mean, and the reality is like, I think about the carbon that we have as like an iceberg. And
Yeah.
right now we have just been looking at the tip, the little triangle above the water,
Yeah.
and which is like scope
Scope
2
one.
and 2.
Yeah.
And then you recognize like, oh, we have like 90+% of the carbon that we have to deal with is under the water. So there's really we don't have a global, for good, I'm glad we don't, some global government that
Yeah.
can actually make everybody do something. So really, it really is the large corporations need to take responsibility for that supply chain. I'm with you. This is something that will put pressure on that supply chain. I do think that I like the way it's sort of being stair-stepped, which is, one is, we're starting, the reality is that you can use spend data and emissions factors to calculate as a starting point, the GHG emissions in your supply chain. So it's not like it's not
So
doable.
you can use inferential data. You don't have to actually have to get the nuts and bolts right away.
Yeah.
You can
So
start
you
with inferential
you
data.
can meet the standard.
Yeah.
So it's not like, every supplier has to all of a sudden have a bottom-up carbon
Yeah.
accounting
Every
and
widget,
reporting.
you don't have to know how much carbon it required for every widget that you get produced all the
Yeah.
way through the chain. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But let's be clear, a company can check the box on compliance, but they're not going to be able to, once that number's there, I mean, that scope 3 number is going to be huge.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden, then companies are going to be like, okay, this scope 3, I got to figure out. Then that's when this secondary data is not enough because you need to understand, well, where in my what could happen with my supply chain? I mean, definitely renewable energy is a no-brainer. Like you just get your suppliers using renewable energy, helping them wherever those supplier economies are, getting those governments to realize they're not going to be globally competitive without, helping their supply chain economy
Yeah.
be competitive. But you will need better data to understand business processes and to support those suppliers. So we're going to have to do two things at the same time: report, compliance, and then innovation and business model adaptation. And that will require better data.
I mean, that's what they talked about. I was chatting with a couple of European lawyers for the series, and they explained how the initial steps in the EU was just a reporting framework, and then once they had a few years of a reporting framework, then they moved into more of okay, now that you have reporting, let's actually put some restrictions on you, let's
Yeah,
put some goals on you, targets, things
yeah,
like that. And to the point that we made earlier, those tools will come now that there
yeah,
is a market or a
yeah,
demand for these tools. Those
yeah,
tools will come to help those suppliers.
yeah,
Um, and now I want to shift into kind of the
yeah,
opportunity
yeah,
because it's not only obviously there's an opportunity for for making the environment better, things like that. But what are some of the other opportunities in this space?
right.
And particularly if we could talk about carbon markets.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like I said, I'm a big advocate for, transparency as just a public policy matter. And at the same time, this disclosure effort was really with like the market in mind. So I'm a big, I think that there's, a ton to be won in this new economy. And I think that, one is that those companies that are able to create, uh, a greener product are also going to be more competitive with consumers. So there's some drivers here. It's not just compliance. We do have like, you look at the Gen Z and the millennials, but especially Gen Z, that it does matter to them what the carbon footprint is of the products that they consume. So I think what we're also doing is helping corporates prepare for what is a new set of kind of requirements for competitiveness. I do think that what we've also seen, and there's some good studies on this, is that when you become more sustainable as a company, you end up getting better as a company, right? Like when you're looking at, for instance, your supply chain or looking within your own internal, like say your warehouse processing. Like when you make that greener, you're also just thinking about like, what are we doing? Could we do this better?
Mhm.
So I think there's a lot of efficiencies that come from having to think about something new. And then with regards to innovation, as I mentioned, those startups, those climate tech companies that maybe have been, getting proof of concept, early stage money, but having a hard time finding a market where they can actually, count on the sort of deployment at scale that's needed to get the financing to become like the big players that we need them to be.
Mhm.
I'm already hearing that with these new mandatory reporting regimes, those companies that maybe had a meeting with a super large company with a huge supply chain were like, maybe we'll be interested in a proof of concept sometime. Let's talk next year. Are now coming back and saying, okay, let's actually open up this conversation.
Yeah.
And we want to figure out how we can create avoided emissions in our supply chain. Can we do things in a different way? So I'm excited about that. In terms of carbon markets, I mentioned avoided emissions. I'm also really a believer in, the carbon markets, and I think SB 253 will help with that. But I also wanted to recognize in California, we also passed a law and enacted a third law, AB 1305, which is basically a carbon credit disclosure law, which requires purchasers of carbon credits in California and sellers of carbon credits into California to a lot more transparency on the
Yeah,
projects.
so not to cut you off, but I mean, I forgive me, but whenever I hear carbon credits, the first thing I think are, and maybe it's just because I spent time in the developing world and I saw several different kind of cowboy practices, but I think of, a guy that has an office in the Brazilian rainforest who's selling carbon credits that don't actually plant any trees or anything like that. So when I think of carbon markets, how do you think about ensuring that
Yeah,
the markets are legitimate?
I know. I mean, it's like sickens me that we've got ourselves into this mess, to be honest, with the carbon markets where we're really in danger of losing the public's and the financial sector's confidence
Yeah.
because it's really hard to get that back. And I think, we unfortunately, part of these things are, I would say, a combination of growing pains. We just sort of like voluntary disclosure for companies moving to mandatory. I mean, a lot of these things have to, it's not bad that they start as voluntary, but there is a certain inability to drive coherence and rigor
Yeah.
in those markets. And I think what happened with the carbon markets is they sort of they've stayed in that space of kind of, like you said, a little bit too much, depends on which way you look at it. Not being exacting enough has meant that you have bad actors. So some are just, growing pains. Then you have bad actors coming in and actually using these loopholes to actually sell, bogus credits. So I think it all gets down to data, transparency, but also traceability. So
Mhm.
that's where there's a, huge new area of growth is around, traceability of the GHG emissions associated with these offsets. And so new standards are being developed. So I think we're trying to build the plane while we fly it, but we absolutely, need to get this straightened out because I do feel like, especially for Global South, I feel like we have all these conversations about climate finance. Global North is not delivering. And so I also feel as an equity matter, we do have to get these markets. Like it's not, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today. I often ask where you see the future of the space heading, and a lot of what we've been talking about is that. I wonder if you have any kind of final thoughts on what you see over the horizon. I'd love to hear it.
I mean, what I see is just from my experience that was so gratifying, like I said, to be able to be, put one brick in that wall. Like we need a lot more to be built. And I think that hopefully what we're seeing too is that we identify, where there are gaps and then we work to fill them. And I think when it comes to the enabling environment, the policy environment, there's still a lot of work to do. So, not only on GHG emissions, and I know you're passionate about supply chain and human rights, and I think we're making some great progress in like things like the CSRD, but I think we now have to move from compliance to like informed action based on compliance. And so we start to see the impacts that we want. So I'm also just really passionate about the accessibility of the data. There's a part of me that, it worries that we will have done all of this and then the data will still be behind paywalls and it won't have the kind of global impact it needs to. So that's another place I'm doing some work on and starting to think about public procurement. What can the public sector do to take responsibility for the investments it makes? So there's tons of work to do for people out there, and I'm excited to just be along for the ride. I'd love to. I'll be in conversation with anybody who I can help think about it.
And I guess I should have said this at the top, but I'll say it at the end. You've been instrumental in me and my efforts to form a working group of people who are interested in passing a revision to California's transparency and supply chains law to address human rights issues, similar to where you had the CSRD and then you had the CS Triple D in Europe. We're hoping to move California's human rights due diligence standards to conform with the human rights standards in Europe. And you've obviously been incredibly helpful in guiding us through that process.
No, I'm
And a
excited.
lot of what we were talking about as far as balancing the playing field,
Yeah,
recognizing laws,
yeah,
all could be said for the human rights context. And particularly if we're going into the supply chain and getting all the scope 3 emissions data, we
yeah.
might as well also get an appreciation for the circumstances of the workers who are
Totally,
doing it.
totally agree with you. It's like sometimes, in life, there are the things you can do.
Mhm.
And this is when I felt like, okay, I could roll up my sleeves on, but it's not the end. And I'm so excited for the effort that you're putting together.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you so much for coming and chatting with us today.
All right, take care, Patrick.
Bye now.